Welcome back. Today we continue our series on memories are made of this. This is a particularly interesting aspect of memory formation, namely, how do you find your car in the parking lot that you parked last night? So it's about spatial memory and, in a way, the GPS system that is built into our brains. This was not known until a few years ago. And it's only in 2014 that three scientists won the Nobel Prize for Medicine for decoding or hacking, as we say now, the code for spatial memory. Now, I need to give credit to one of these scientists for alerting me to the fact that this event or this context has to do with an ancient problem in philosophy. And as you see in the first slide, you see two philosophers here of the 1700s, namely David Hume and Emmanuel Kant. In an interview that Edward Moser gave to a TV station, I guess, he made a fleeting reference to the fact that Kant was right in how he visualized how space is dealt with by the human mind. And he said Kant was right. So this off-the-cuff remark led me on a wild goose chase to find out what is really at the bottom of this remark and how is a 1700 problem of philosophy related to a 21st century finding in neuroscience. So let's spend a couple of minutes on this. On the left side you see a philosopher named David Hume, who is an empiricist. He lived in Scotland. He was very skeptical of any speculative or metaphysical ideas about what we can know about the universe and how the human mind works. He emphasized we should rely on what we can detect with our senses, and we should be very careful in jumping to conclusions about what's happening between our ears. Now, he wrote a book on this, which became widely read in Europe, and Emmanuel Kant in Königsberg, East Prussia, Germany at the time, picked up on this and really struggled the rest of his life to prove David Hume wrong in some important sense. So Kant believed that we do have some innate abilities that we need in order to make sense at all about all the sensory information that comes into our nervous system in order to structure it and in order to categorize it. Now, in the next slide is a brief excerpt from the Plato Stanford EDU entries here. It's the website from Stanford on philosophers. And you can see here it makes reference to the fact that Kant believed that space is not a discursive, or as one says, general concept of relations of things in general, but pure intuition, something that the human mind somehow creates out of whole cloth. And the technical language that Kant is using is the so-called a priori intuition. A priori basically meaning before any sensory data is used to do any computation or calculation, there are instances or there are categories in the human mind that allow you to compute things basically without any sensory input. Now, we're doing a course on neuroscience, of course. We can substitute, and the next slide, the idea of the brain having these categories rather than the human mind. So questions about space and navigation have engaged philosophers forever. But it's only in 1971 that one important discovery was made by John O'Keefe, who also won the Nobel Prize in 2014, that there are certain cells in the rat hippocampus which fire only if the rat finds itself in a certain location in a circumscribed area of space. And these cells have been subsequently called space cells. May-Britt and Edward Moser, working in Toronto, Norway, extended this work and discovered so-called grid cells. Grid cells fire when an animal crosses certain areas of space. I will show you this in just a minute, how this works in the next slide. But before, let's go back a short excursion to Emmanuel Kant. So he says that there are structures in our own mind that impose representations, and space is not a property of things in themselves, but it is somehow created by our mind. And the next slide, you see a cartoon that shows this. You see the globe of the world imposed on the nervous system. So somehow we impose categories, spatial categories in this case, in our way of perceiving the world. Kant drew incredibly wide-ranging conclusions from this, saying that we can never really know the world in itself. We can only know a certain reflection or a processed image of the world as it is imposed by our brain upon the data that are generated from the world. In the next slide, let's start with how this algorithm works. The first premise is geometrical knowledge is a synthetic a priori, meaning that the knowledge of a triangle, for example, is not something that you see in nature. There are no perfect triangles in nature. It is synthesized algorithmically and geometrically from certain idealized ideas of a line, of an angle, and such. The next slide, you see a triangle here, and there are certain rules, namely that all the angles in the triangle add up to 180 degrees. There are no exceptions. There are no ifs and or buts. It's just the way it is. So the sum of the angles is not contingent on anything. It is an ironclad law of geometry, and is not discovered by examining nature. It's discovered by some operation internal to the human mind. The next slide is another depiction of this. So geometry then is a so-called synthetic a priori. It's produced without sensory input in the human mind. The next slide shows you again a depiction of this. So it's independent of sensory input. It's rather constructed in the human brain, and the question now is where and how are these algorithms implemented, and was Kant correct in his supposition of such a module? The next slide. We follow now with premise 2. Synthetic a priori knowledge is possible only if space is merely a form of our intuition and not a property of things themselves. So the conclusion then is that space must be a form of intuition or internal operation, and a structure of our own minds imposed onto our representation of the world. So now let's substitute the word brain for mind, and we can say that there must be a computational device in our brain which imposes certain structural ideas about space before we enter into the world and gather experiences. So we come equipped with this module, and it will determine everything we do henceforth. The next slide. So here then is the idea, spatial dimensions. You have a Cartesian expression here for location. There are two kinds of memories, of course, in the hippocampus. One is what was an event and when did it happen? And the second memory is where did it happen? So could it be that there's a Kantian microchip in the hippocampus? Next slide. And here you see a brief video in which Maybrit Moser narrates the experience of a rat walking around a square, and whenever the rat will cross certain coordinates, Cartesian coordinates in a sense, in this plane, a so-called grid cell will fire. And as you have seen in the video, next slide, the grid cells form a pattern. Each dark dot is a single firing of a grid cell, and you can see that it covers the entire space according to where you are in this space. And let's go back a couple of slides, and you can see here the wiring pattern of the hippocampus. Most importantly, these grid cells are located in the entorhinal cortex, namely the medial or the lateral entorhinal cortex, which then extends synapses either directly into CA1 region of the hippocampus or by the indirect pathway. We begin with the entorhinal cortex, which by a direct pathway sends synapses directly to the CA1 region, and the indirect pathway goes from the entorhinal cortex to the dentate gyrus and subsequently to CA1 and other areas of the hippocampus. Now, you may ask, how can we be sure that any computation done in the hippocampus is not in some way influenced by direct impact of sensory data? How can we be sure that the computation is done self-generated and created in some way by the assembly of neurons that are involved here? In the next slide, I show you a dizzying and mind-bending diagram of the connections in the brain that have been mapped by Van Essen and collaborators over the years. And you can see at the bottom the input from the visual cortex, the retina to lateral geniculus to V1 and so forth. And you can see all these different stations that are in between before we arrive at the hippocampus at the very last. So the hippocampus then sits on top of an extended food chain of neuronal processing. And by the time any signal arrives there, it doesn't bear any resemblance to the original visual input. In other words, we can assume that signals related to space in the hippocampus have very little to do with the original visual input. Next slide shows you what the geometry is that these grid cells produce. And you can see that we have a hexagonal pattern that is mapped out by grid cells that you can superimpose on the firing pattern. The next slide. The hexagonal patterns are mapped out on the medial entorhinal cortex in such a way that a denser pattern is generated on one end, and it is increasingly amplified towards the other end. And this allows for tremendous computational advantage. It's a logarithmic or geometric way to compute increasing volumes of space or increasing areas of a plane. Next paragraph. Next slide. Okay. So the grid cells then provide an example of internal generated structure. The strong internal structure is reminiscent of the Kantian idea regarding the necessity of an innate spatial structure. with which to understand the spatial organization of the world. Together, a relatively small number of modules have the potentially exponential coding capacity, representing a neural code of unprecedented power and efficiency. This is a comment written by Neil Burgess in a commentary on these Nobel Prizes given in 2014, which appeared in Neuron. The next slide. So this is a series of images that are from the Nobel Prize Committee. So you see here the grid cells on top and place cells in yellow at the bottom, and the location of the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus. In the next slide. This then is the hexagonal pattern that is mapped out by the activity of the grid cell. So this then says that this rat knows math. There are no hexagons in nature to look at. There are no triangles in nature to look at. But by the innate ability of the grid cells, the animal is able to establish a hexagonal-based map of the geometry of the space it finds itself in. And there are some mathematical modeling approaches to determine how this is possible. In the next slide, we see another representation of this. Next slide. So this then is one of the key papers by Maybrit Moser and Edward Moser from Norway, and the microstructure of spatial map in the entorhinal cortex, leading to a conclusion that it was shown that grid formation did not arise out of simple transformation of sensory motor signals, but out of complex network activity. So this then was one of the stipulations that Kant had, that the spatial computation should be a priori before any visual or sensory input arrives in our mind/brain. There should be an internal module that computes space. Next slide. Shows you a mathematical model of how this might work, a so-called Attractor network model. All you have to assume that cells that are firing rapidly in response to a certain location send out inhibitory synapses to the immediate neighboring cells. And if you follow this through computationally, you wind up with a pattern of hexagons or triangles, and that's in fact what you find in the intact animals if you record intracellularly from these grid cells. So now you have a completed arc from a philosophical idea in the 1700s to a neuroscience experiment in the early 2000s and a mathematical model which describes how the finding can be explained in terms of neuronal activity by a mathematical algorithm. Next slide. Now, does this happen only in the rat, or is it a more universal finding? Well, it has been found, these grid cells have been found in many organisms, and more recently they have been detected in humans. On occasion during neurosurgery to prepare a patient for surgical intervention for seizure disorders, it is possible to record individual cells in certain brain regions. And this has been done in this particular experiment. In the next slide, you see a virtual navigation task. So the patient is in a scanner and he drives the car and has to navigate in a virtual environment. And you can then follow the activity of cells in the brain. In the next slide, you see a number of cells being recorded in a number of patients. And what you can clearly see is this typical grid pattern emerging, for example, here and here, giving clear evidence that humans, as well as rats, have the same a priori computational device in the brain. Next slide. Now, there's a very recent finding which I will touch on very briefly, and that is that it's possible that a grid-like geometrical firing pattern may also be important, not just in pure spatial localization terms, but also for mapping concepts in some kind of more abstract conceptual space. Next slide. So it's been hypothesized that the brain organizes concepts into some kind of mental map, allowing conceptual relationships to be navigated in a manner similar to that of space. So in the next slide, I show you this experiment. It's a very ingenious experiment in which you had to modify either the length of the neck or the length of the legs of these birds virtually, and linking a certain prototypical bird to a certain reward, such as a Christmas tree or a Santa Claus. So these modifications can be done continuously. In the next slide. Next slide. You can see by adjusting a scale on the left-hand side, you can extend selectively either the legs or shorten the neck of this bird, for example. And you can map the adjustment in the brain to the new category of a particular type bird that will link to a particular type reward and measure the computational responses of the brain. In the next slide. Here, for example, is a typical bird that will give you a Santa Claus, and in the next slide you see what's happening in the brain. And on panel A you see a network for navigation in physical space, and on the B panel a conceptual network for the navigating concept space. And you can see the homology of these networks and the overlap. Now, this is the only paper that I'm aware of at this time that attempts to map the spatial algorithms in the brain to the idea of higher abstract thought. I believe more of this will be forthcoming, and we may wind up with further proof of some other ideas of Emmanuel Kant, perhaps, of some other categories that he found important in his dissection of the human mind. So then, this was a romp through philosophy, through neuroscience in the 21st century, to the very cutting edge of determining how we find ourselves in space, and perhaps hinting at how we find ourselves in conceptual space. Thank you very much for your attention, and we see you soon for the next lecture.